It's Natasha. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to be the second presenter for today, but just wanted to say hi and introduce myself. And with that, I will pass it over to Sarah, who will kick off our presentation.
Thanks, Natasha. So yes, my name is Sarah. I also use she and her pronouns, and I'm in Halifax right now. So the land acknowledgement would be relevant to the Mi'kmaq people here. And as we're going through the presentation, I encourage you all, as we said, to recognize the land that you guys are on, as well as thinking about some of the issues surrounding science and science communication right now, and doing all we can to make sure that we're communicating effectively and making sure that we're spreading awareness on reducing some public health issues that are currently going on right now, as we all know, in the midst of a pandemic. So we're really excited to get started here. And yeah, we're good to go, Natasha. So today we're going to talk about first why visual communication is so important and why it's really beneficial to use, particularly in our research environment. I'm going to introduce you to the company a little bit, give you a little bit more information about Designs That Sell. This may be a little repetitive for those who had attended our earlier ORT webinar, so please be patient with us there. But then we'll get into some steps and resources for you all to make effective scientific illustrations. And we want you to really be able to take some of the resources that we show and share with you today and develop your own skills in scientific illustration and communication. So to start off, we'll talk a little bit about what the problem is or the issue. There are several methods and places where we really need visual communication, particularly which is most relevant for most of you attending today, is that scientists need to communicate their science. In addition, funders are now routinely asking for knowledge dissemination and translation plans and applications. So I'm sure if any of you have written any CIHR and CIRC grants this season, you've noticed that they are going to ask you for a knowledge translation plan. In addition, scientific journals are more frequently seeking original figures, graphical abstract, and even some journals are now conducting illustrated reviews, which essentially are topic reviews, but in a way that's presented visually. Additionally, there's other healthcare settings which visual communication comes and plays an important role, including the fact that doctors need to communicate with their patients. And also, of course, public health practitioners need to communicate with the public, which now we've seen, as I mentioned, in the pandemic is more important than ever. So how do we do this? And the solution really is that you need to be able to make customizable figures that can communicate scientific findings through evidence-based visual communication strategies. Oh, there's some background here, so I'm going to ask whoever is entering to please mute themselves. So as you can see on the right, I don't know if we have the chat function, but I'm sure many of you can easily recognize where this illustration comes from. And this nature illustration is a perfect example of how you can brand your science and how your science for yourself can be easily recognizable. Moving on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we want to use visuals. The first, which is probably most obvious for all of you, is that we engage with a lot of different research and a lot of different content. What we know about visual communication and visual science communication is that it's more memorable. If you remember going to different poster sessions or listening to presentations, probably the most memorable science that you've engaged with is that uses visual communication most effectively. Additionally, you can attract audience and readers, especially in the environment where we're putting up a lot of our research online and we're hoping to get readership by engaging people with things like abstracts or tweets or sharing things in blogs and social media. It's really important to use visual communication to get those audiences interested in what you're trying to present. It also provides the opportunity to clarify and fine-tune ideas. So for scientists who work with limited word counts, being able to essentially summarize and explain a concept or an idea or a hypothesis using visual communication and being able to save your word count for what actually counts for what you need to explain is a really good tool and should be in your toolbox when you're grant writing. Additionally, accessibility should be something on our minds as we're thinking about people who can't always engage with written communication, particularly knowing that science is something that's a worldwide language, while reading is not, visual communication is. And usually, even if people are not so familiar with a primary language, they're able to understand through your graphics, through your visuals, what the scientific information is meant to do. Oh, sorry, there's still some background. Please make sure that you're muting yourself. In addition to that, another kind of factor which is really important sorry, I think I was muted for a second there. And the most important thing here is to reduce cognitive load. So we're going to be talking about this in a number of different places throughout this presentation. And with this, I would like to give an example of really what the point of reducing cognitive load is and what we're trying to do here. As scientists, we like facts, we like numbers, so I've quantitated it here for you. The average English adult sentence reading speed is about 200 words per minute. In that same minute, your brain could have been processing 1,200 images. So that is something that you can think about when you're trying to engage people and get them to read something like an abstract, which we're going to show you next. And so this is an abstract that we worked on with a cancer survivorship scientist in Halifax here, and Natasha and Molly both collaborated on this. And what we're really showing you here is on the left, this is something you would typically see when you're engaging with an article and deciding if you're likely to read the article or, spend that time to go in and really learn about the methods and objectives and results. And we took this and translated it essentially into an infographic. Infographic meaning information graphic. And what you can see here is that something that would take you quite a bit of time to read, on the right side, there's still text, there's still content, but it's complemented with graphics, which will help people pick up what you're trying to put down and what you're trying to communicate a lot easier. And so this is what we mean by reducing cognitive load. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how Designs That Sell was born. I founded Designs That Sell in 2017, and I used my combined previous experiences, including an undergraduate degree in biomedical sciences, my experience founding a nonprofit organization, Indigo Girls Group, and years of art classes studying design and learning aspects of tools of Adobe Suite. And so I combined these things with my graduate research and understanding and my passion for visual science communication to found a company. And the reason I put this here is because not everyone needs business experience. You don't need to have, an education in how to run a business or even how to do that, because there are so many different resources. And so as we're going through this, if anyone's really passionate about a side hustle that they'd like to initiate, or they're really passionate about something like scientific illustration, it's a great area where you can really get involved in with limited business experience. You can start out, and there are a lot of different resources. So if anyone has questions about how to get a company started, and you're in grad school or you're figuring out exactly what you're going to do, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll make sure that you get connected with some of those resources. And so I'm going to walk you through the timeline of Designs That Sell. And initially, I started in 2017 by myself. Again, this was like something I was doing during grad school. And so I really focused on just putting a price tag and putting a service so that I could get paid for these services that I was doing for multiple colleagues and friends. And so it started off with just scientific illustrations for publication and for individuals who are completing their thesis. But quickly, we started picking up pace, and I definitely had more clients than I could handle myself. And so I brought on 3 amazing women, Naomi, Natasha, and Mina. Natasha, who's going to be speaking to you and you've heard from a little bit. And we started encompassing science communication more generally, including the design and thought process behind educational materials, and also starting to use infographics, particularly in the healthcare setting. And we combined the experience of these different individuals. So Naomi being a very focused anatomist, Natasha completing her master's of public health, and Mina being focused on plant science and plant biology. And so we were able to kind of collectively use our experiences to put them to use in things like educational materials and infographics. So in 2019, we further expanded this to be able to speak to content creation and branding packages. So currently we provide branding packages for science communication focused organizations or companies, but we also do some pro bono work for any type of organization that focuses on youth education and empowerment in STEM. So keep that in mind. If you have a organization that you believe in, we are definitely eager to help you get that branding up and running. In addition, the content creation that we're speaking to here is for scientific companies who are trying to communicate their ideas or their methods or their clinical trial to essentially the lay audience. And finally, we're moving on to 2020, which is this year, and we've started a few unique and exciting services. One of which is a grant figure review service. So we'll spend within 2 weeks of your grant deadline working with you to make sure that your grant figure is communicating exactly what you need it to and works really well and complements the writing that you're putting in and all the hard work that you put into a grant. And we're also offering for students at a very low price abstract and poster reviews, which will help for kind of just having an extra set of eyes to make sure that you're communicating visually as best as that you can. And we've also expanded our team from this and started this year our summer internships, which were designed for undergraduate students who lost opportunities to COVID. But Natasha and I just had a great time with our interns this year. And so we've actually decided to move forward with the interns, making them a more formal learning opportunity for students. And we'll be doing them again this summer. So that information is on our website. And now moving into essentially the steps and resources and toolkit that we're going to give you from this webinar. And we're happy to share the slides as well with you, but we've also published in the BMJ Student, which was a great experience. I recommend anyone who's thinking about writing a commentary or an opinion piece or a resource to reach out to the BMJ Student editors. They're very helpful with getting your work out in a very articulate and concise way, and also reaching a broad variety of audiences. And so we're going to talk about some extra steps here today that we've been developing and working on, although we'll still hit those core things that are included in the 8 steps here that we've written up in this publication. So we're first going to start off with establishing a communication goal. And so this is kind of really the answer to why are you working on this visual communication? And so some examples for things might be awareness or advocacy. So maybe you want to make an infographic on something that you're researching. I study ovarian cancer, and I've been kind of working on the background just for something that I can use in my own presentations and to explain to people why it's a problem. You can also use them in the healthcare setting. So I know some of you are training to be physicians. It's a really good consideration for being able to communicate in a time-effective manner when, we all know that doctors really are not the people to have so much time on their hands that they're able to explain everything sometimes. So visuals can really help with that. In addition, of course, relevant to all grad students and anyone working in research generally, to disseminate your scientific findings. My favorite quote by Anne Rowe is that science communication and the value of science really isn't there for public and isn't there for a lay audience until we are able to take what we've learned and take what we've found in the lab or in the clinic and disseminate that and share that with the community. So answering the question, why do I care? Why am I interested? Is always kind of a good first step. And the second step that we're going to talk about is understanding your intended audience. So there's a lot of information on here, but essentially you should be able to tell me who you're focused on, who you're explaining to, and why it's important for them. So what this might mean is perhaps you're putting together a review publication. Are you going to be presenting this and publishing this in a disease-specific journal? If you are, there might be some content that you're able to skip over or not explain as much as you would if you were putting it out, let's say, into a science review, something where you're going to have a lot of individuals from different fields engaging with your scientific illustration. Additionally, visuals are really great for blowing out from more general illustrations to add additional context, or to go the opposite way and simplify when it's required. So you can kind of have a core illustration that you use for your research and remove components that are not necessary, or add in components that you feel are necessary, whether that's like as you're developing your research and you find new interesting findings. Having a visual that you're really core and you're able to go back to is useful. But within any type of new visual illustration, you want to be able to keep your audience in mind while you're going through all the other steps. So make sure who's looking at this, how are they engaging with this, and what can I do to make it more accessible for them is on the top of your mind when you're creating your visuals. And additionally, something for lay audiences to consider is establishing familiar context. This really helps people understand what they're looking at and process, again, reducing that cognitive load. So things like putting a setting of a hospital, a school, or living room when it's relevant for the content that you're presenting. You also want to avoid using any type of inferences. I know sometimes I like to put in little, gems for individuals who might be very niche in the science or in the field that I'm presenting in. But honestly, as somebody who would want to be as accessible as possible when talking with wide audiences, you want to make sure that there's nothing that can be misunderstood, or they would have to have another level of understanding. So everything there they should be able to use that content to understand what you're putting forward with your research. And so an example of that is this infographic that was again done this summer with a COVID internship that was curated by Genevieve and illustrated by and also curated by Anya Preet, who are both chemists. So this is, if anyone can remember without having PTSD about organic chemistry in undergrad, the SN2 reaction. But specifically, I want to point to the pane on the bottom, or the panel on the bottom, where we have let Jane explain. And so this type of narrative or creating an individual who's going through a process and walking them through is a really great way to communicate a complex idea into something that's simplified and people can imagine and understand themselves. We're not going to focus more on this, but if you'd like to check out these infographics, they're again available on our website, and they're currently being pilot tested at the University of Ottawa to see if they're effective as supplemental education tools in organic chemistry education. And so the third step is to identify a platform. And I know you're not all artists who are here and listening, and you definitely don't need to be. I'd like to highlight that a beautiful infographic or a visual does not equal an effective infographic or visual. And so there are a lot of tools that are out there that are specifically useful for individuals who don't have those skills, but there are also tools that are great for people who do or would like to test out their creative side. So I know when talking with a lot of graduate students, some people are really eager to go on Adobe Suite, work in Illustrator or Photoshop and be able to produce really great visuals, but it can be very time consuming. And so I'd just like to highlight that as you move with something that's very low complexity for user friendliness to most complex, you also move with customizability, but that might not be exactly what you need. So think about the types of platforms that there are. These things like Canva and Pictochart and Mengage are really great for drag and drop, and there are some paid features where you can customize a little bit more. Of course, PowerPoint's a great tool. There are free hand draws as well as those shape tools that you can use to create your illustrations. While Inkscape and Adobe Illustrator are a little bit more complex, they do provide you the option to have those vector illustrations. So vector being things that are scalable without getting pixelated. So when you're creating illustrations for things like giant posters, or you want to put them on a big PowerPoint, then you might consider going that route. And so the next step is picking your main takeaways. So I always like to talk to researchers and scientists by explaining this as being your main results title. So even if it's a figure for a review that you really want to be communicating, you shouldn't have more than, I would say, 3 main points that you're trying to communicate in that, whether it's, an abstract that you're putting together, or something for review or an infographic. What are the 3 points that people are going to prioritize, that you're going to prioritize to communicate and people are going to prioritize to take away? And these things should be action oriented, simple. You should never have paragraphs ever, really. And then I also have this little kind of exception. If you'd like to put a paragraph in for the introduction, that's really okay. But past that, you want people to be able to be taking your main message. And as we talked about, visuals are a lot easier to understand and a lot easier to pick up because of that reduced cognitive load than text. So keep that in mind as well. And an example that I'd like to give is The Plight of the Pangolin, which was created by Naomi Robson, and she's currently working at the University of Toronto to get her Master's of Biomedical Communication. And so this was a school project that she did, but I really like it for a few different reasons. And why I'm using this as an example for the main points is because in the bottom right of the infographic, as you'll see, they're a really clear message. Be an advocate, spread the word. So she has a clear intent behind this infographic. She's also put in some actionable titles there for what she'd like you to do with this infographic and why you should care. And so this again acts as a resource for you. It's also a very beautiful color scheme. So if you're ever looking for colors, you can come back to this. And additionally, the pangolins, of course, are in their natural habitat, which is a setting that we can understand and recognize quite quickly. And the baby pangolin is very cute. So another example of this that might be a little bit more familiar to us is the central dogma of molecular biology, which, as many of you probably know, has 3 main concepts. We move from DNA to RNA to protein. And so I'm really showing this because on the left, we have the exact same content that's shown on the right, but it's done in a way that's not as clear because you don't have your 3 points highlighted. On the right, you have those 3 ideas going from DNA to RNA to protein very clearly outlined. And so this is an example of using those 3 points very efficiently. Obviously, this is an easy one because there's only 3 main points and it's quite simple, but if you follow some principles like this, you can turn something that's a little bit less clear to communicate into something that's a lot more clear. And so with this, we also want to make sure that we're considering our target audience needs. So for content, something that I'd like to provide you some resources here. This book is available online, teaching patients with low literacy skills. If you're working in healthcare, if you're trying to communicate your research to a lay audience, this is a great tool. On the right here, we have the SWOG index, or the simple measure of gobbledygook. And that's actually a validated scientific scale that was developed essentially to test the readability or the reading level of your text or content. So this is important whether you're talking with lay audiences or peers. It's important to understand and take within that context what exactly reading level you're processing at. And so I do this for every infographic, every visual that I have. I put in the text that I'm going to be incorporating. even for my review articles to check what reading level this is at. And I want to make sure that, for example, somebody who is in high school who's taken some basic biology classes, if they're really interested in this particular review, would be able to look at my illustrations and understand them. And so the next thing we're talking about is organization. This is really extremely important for, again, reducing cognitive load, because people and the way that we process information is mostly very linear. And so what I mean by that is we want to have a very clear place of where we're going to start and where we're going to end. And this is the same, again, whether you're doing a review figure, or showing your research through data, or you're working on like a very artistic infographic. You want something to be able to guide the viewer through your content or your data. And so what I recommend for people who are starting out with this is using squares as placeholders. So, if you know that you're going to have text or content, you can have just a square and have that as, this is where my text is going to go, or this is where this illustration or pictogram will go. And you always, in the English culture and content, we want to go from left to right and top to bottom. Obviously, that's not the same in all cultures or all languages, but it is the best for being able to process and communicate in English. Past that, you want to be able to have a central focus for the eye. And so this is where you want to be drawn in to be able to essentially start off. Or this can alternatively be a main takeaway or a main result that you want to highlight. So sometimes this is, step one or the introduction. And sometimes this can also be, a Venn diagram or a pie chart that really shows the point of the visual or the takeaway. It's also important to make sure that they're layered and that they're guided in an efficient way. So the way that you can guide people through an illustration might be headings. Headings really help us compartmentalize and be able to understand. Arrows are another great tool. However, beware the overuse of arrows. So anytime you're using more than 10 arrows in one type of schematic or illustration, I'd kind of question the reason that you're using them and if it can be done in some other way. Other strategies might be numbering, so clearly having steps so that someone can follow through. Color is another great tool. If you're comfortable using color, things like using gradients from very light to very dark can also provide the same goal. Additionally, white space or negative space, which Natasha will talk a little bit about later, is really important for being able to separate processes. So being able to make sure that a bunch of information isn't clumped together can actually help somebody pick up that information faster. So sometimes more is less in this case. And to exemplify this, I've just used basic endosomal processes from a textbook. And so for this, essentially you have, this is actually from the same textbook, on the left and on the right. On the left, the process is explained by using letters. However, as you can see, they've used an abundance of arrows that might not always be most required or most needed. And on the right, you essentially have the same information. However, it's presented in a way where you have essentially a numerical start and a numerical finish, and you have a process that generally flows throughout. So you can turn something from the left into something on the right just by being organized about where you're placing the content that you're placing and how you're demonstrating it. Sometimes, like I said, overuse of arrows can really complicate things. I think they've used a few here where they could use a little less. However, there is a vast improvement from the illustration on the left. And so to give you another example of something that I have really loved for organization, some of you may know of Vesta. She created this COVID-19 infographic this year, which has been translated into almost like 54 languages and was published in the scientific magazine or the science magazine. And so what I like about this infographic and what I'd like to highlight is there's a very clear start on the top left. You move through the healthy, infected, moderately infected, and severely infected individual. And then on the right, she has these actionable takeaways about what you could do. So, 1, social distancing, 2, stay healthy, 3, stay informed. She's very clear about those steps and the way that it moves through. So this is a perfect example of something that's like organized in an excellent way. And just to show you kind of the back or behind the scenes of, what goes into it, she also tweeted this, which I thought was really fantastic because it shows how much work and how much thought goes into strategizing how you're presenting and communicating information. And if you also look at the top right of that hand sketched area that she's working on, she has 3 key points that she'd like to hit with this. And those are, again, those 3 questions. What is it? How does it transmit? Why does this matter? So those are her 3 main takeaways or main results that she'd like to focus on. And she's established that very early in designing this infographic. So keep in mind that the more intent that you put behind the thought process and the organization of an infographic, the more easily someone's going to be able to walk through it and understand it. And so that's the end of my section for today. I put my Twitter here as well as my email. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I think we're going to do questions at the end collectively. So Natasha is going to be following you through with the other tips and resources here.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So to continue right on with the different steps, I'm just going to move on. I think we're on step 5, if I recall correctly. So step 5 is concerning the overall layout and composition of your image and illustration. And we've kind of broken it down into the ABCDs, and I'm going to talk about each one of these in more depth, but one kind of general note is that all of the layout and composition elements depend on the type of data that you're going to be using and what your main point of the data is. So for instance, if you're showing how something is changing over time, it's great to use a timeline in a linear fashion. Whereas if you're trying to show differences in geographic location, then it's a great idea to use a map. So no matter what kind of general layout you're using, the ABCDs will apply to all of them. So the first one, A, is alignment. And this is pretty straightforward. It's basically saying that it's best to keep things within the same line or plane so that they're all lined up. And all of the illustration and online tools that Sarah highlighted earlier have their own built-in alignment tools, making it really easy to align things left, center, right, whatever is appropriate for your illustration. And to illustrate how alignment, 2 examples of alignment, we have here 2 illustrations of hematopoiesis, or the differentiation of blood cells. And you can see that in the image on the left, the cells aren't aligned horizontally, making it kind of challenging to get your bearings. Whereas on the cells on the right, everything is aligned very nicely, so it makes it really easy to take in. And as well, you can see where things are at in terms of the level. So you can see, okay, the common myeloid progenitor and the common lymphoid progenitor are at the same stage in development. Whereas you would really have to focus in on the image on the left to get that same information. So the B in the layout and composition stands for balanced. So this is what Sarah briefly alluded to earlier, is considering the negative or white space and kind of the background area around the different components of your illustration. Because we've all seen things that look really crowded, it's difficult to read, it can be overwhelming, and you're not sure where to really start. So using appropriate amounts of white and negative space make the infographic or illustration look easier to read, so it's more approachable. As well, it's also a great way to separate different concepts. So again, for an example of this, here are 2 illustrations of photosynthesis. And you can see, just again, comparing the left to the right, that the illustration on the left is more centered and it seems less cluttered because of the use of white or negative space in the background. Whereas the illustration on the right, there's more clutter, there's lots of things happening, and it just seems it's not as visually appealing because whoever designed it didn't take into consideration that negative space. All right, moving right along. So C stands for contrast. And I know that many of you have heard of contrast before and may often think of color contrast. But the way we're using contrast here is to differentiate the different components of your illustration. So that could look like highlighting key points, maybe in a different color. It could look like bolding or using a different font type for different points, as well as maybe using objects to bring emphasis. I hear a bit of background noise. It'd be great if you could mute yourself. Thank you. And for an example of contrast, here's our 2 illustrations of the nitrogen cycle. Again, both of these showing the same information, but immediately you can tell that the illustration on the left is a lot more effective because they've put those key components of the nitrogen cycle, they've outlined them in the white boxes, and they've also used red arrows to really highlight how the cycle works. Whereas the illustration on the right is all the arrows and labels are in the same like font size, same shade of black. So again, it's kind of confusing and your eye isn't sure, there isn't a clear path for your eye to follow. Whereas in the left illustration, there definitely is. And the last of the ABCDs, the D stands for duplicate. And this means that you want to, in all the elements you use in your illustration or infographic, you want to aim for internal consistency so that you keep the same style and look throughout the entire illustration. So this pretty much includes everything in your illustration, including the color scheme, the typography you use, the methods of contrast, and the methods of hierarchy. So this means how you differentiate what is most important versus what is least important. And this is important because it really allows the readers to focus in on your science and message. So they're not spending time trying to figure out like, why is this color so out of place? Like, why does this look like it doesn't belong? Instead, with like one style and look in your illustration, readers can just focus right in on your main points. All right, so to illustrate this concept, again, we have two illustrations here, both showing the cell cycle. And the one on the left is just a lot. So you can see there's lots of different colors. It's doing a kind of like 3D approach. So there's different like sizes of the cells. And it's a bit non-intuitive and difficult to follow. Whereas the one on the right is just a simple process. Everything's nicely aligned. And the color and style is consistent throughout. So this is something that Sarah brought up as well. So you might think that an illustration like the one on the left, if it like looks better, would be a better choice, but actually it's not as effective at communicating the main messages. So even though the illustration on the right is a bit more simple and laid back, I think it's a lot more effective in getting the main points across, and it's more accessible for people who might not be as familiar with the topic. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is colors. And colors are a great and extremely useful tool when they're used properly. Something to note when we're speaking of colors is that for certain instances, so if you are perhaps sending in a figure and you know that it's going to be published in black and white, or you know that someone might print it off in black and white, shading works exactly the same way and is also helpful for accessibility. So just something to keep in mind if you're in a situation where it's not practical to use color. But if that's not the case for you, and you're using colors, then you want to keep everything as physiologically sensible as possible. So pick a color scheme from the thing you're researching, and don't try and challenge the norms. Because if you do, there are actually substantial consequences of using confusing or misleading colors. And this can also introduce bias into your illustration. So we've just highlighted some like typical norms here. So green is usually showing an increase or promoting or activating something, whereas red is a decrease or regulating or suppressing something. And here are two illustrations that both use colors in different ways. So they're both showing blood vessels. But you can see that the illustration on the left, which is a cross-section of the blood vessel, there doesn't seem to be a clear rationale for the colors they picked. They just kind of went with something pinkish, reddish with blue for the nuclei. And it doesn't make a lot of physiological sense. Whereas in the illustration on the right, there's just a simple red and blue, and then a bit of a gradient in the middle. And of course, the red is signifying the oxygenated blood, and the blue is signifying the deoxygenated blood. So although it's a simpler color scheme, I would argue that it's actually more effective in communicating the major message in this instance. As well, it's important to consider accessibility when you're choosing colors. And this is especially critical if you're displaying data, perhaps in an infographic, in some kind of chart. So for those instances, try and combine, don't just use color to differentiate different data, differentiate it as well with patterns, textures, or shapes, as well as shading. And this will increase the accessibility of your illustration to people who have color blindness. So in particular, there are a few color combinations that should not be combined and should never be overlapped. And those include red and green, green and brown, green and blue, blue and gray, blue and purple, and green and black. And again, the rationale for this is because if you are overlapping these two colors, individuals with color blindness may not be able to differentiate which is which. And a great tool that myself and I think most of the Designs That Sell team uses when picking colors, it's a website called Coolures. The QR code is linked there, but it's a space where you can generate your own color schemes. You can browse other color schemes that other users have created. You can look at different themes. And a really interesting feature, again, speaking to accessibility needs, is that you can, if you made a color scheme, you can take a look at what it looks like for individuals with color blindness. Again, making sure that it is accessible for everyone. And I wanted to highlight this illustration, which was curated by our amazing summer intern, Abdullah, and designed by our illustrator, Molly. And this is an instance where less is more in terms of colors. So this infographic is about the importance of iron supplementation in pregnant women. And because it's intended for a lay audience, we wanted, again, to make it as accessible as possible. And part of that was the color scheme. So you can see that there are only really two colors in here. We have the blue with varying shades of blue, light and dark. And then we have the red. And the red was used to highlight the iron itself in the illustration. And it was also used to highlight the key points of each kind of cell in the table there. So sometimes having just two colors can be really effective. All right, moving right along to the next step, which is typography. And this is probably more relevant for if you're creating an infographic as opposed to like a figure for publication, but still something to consider. Because the typography or the font that you use has a large impact on how your visual is perceived. And generally, fonts can be divided into two main categories. The first is called sans serif, an example of which is Arial. And this comes across as very modern, approachable, and easy to read. Whereas the other category is serif. And serif actually refers to these small horizontal lines which are added to the tops and the bottoms of letters. So this gives a more classic, traditional, and sometimes formal feel. And a key example of this is Times New Roman. And just to kind of highlight how fonts can affect the approachability of an image, here are two scientific posters. They're not the same scientific poster in this instance. They're about different topics, but without even reading or looking too closely at the graphs, it's easy to see that the poster on the left, because it's using that sans serif font, does have a more approachable and kind of friendly feel, whereas the poster on the right seems a bit more formal and traditional. So again, it depends on the context and what kind of message you're trying to send in your illustration. As well, something to note as well is typographic efficiency. And this refers to two things. So legibility, that's the ease at which a word is recognized, and then readability, which is how well the text itself can be understood. And in total, these affect the speed of reading and how well the reader comprehends the material. So something interesting is that serifs, like Times New Roman, have less typographic efficiency than sans serif fonts, such as Arial. And this is true for large font sizes. However, when we're getting into like really small font sizes, it's actually serifs that have greater typographic efficiency. So just something to note. So for example, if you are making a really large poster with large font sizes, it's probably best to pick one or perhaps two sans serif fonts to use. And an excellent resource for finding fonts and downloading them is Google Fonts. Again, a QR linked here, but there are, I think, over 700 fonts, if I remember correctly. And again, you can try examples, sort through different categories. So it's a great resource when picking fonts. All right, we're almost there. And the next step I wanted to talk about was labeling. So when you're labeling a diagram, it's important to only really label what needs to be labeled, because you don't want to label too much, because then you're kind of cluttering the illustration and missing your important points. But you also don't want to underlabel, because your readers need to be able to understand what your illustration is communicating. As well, try and pick one orientation for all of your labels, whether that be horizontal, vertical, or at a 45-degree angle. Keep all of your line thicknesses the same for all of your labels. And like I mentioned earlier, when speaking about alignment, it's really crucial to align all of your labels in one way so that they look cohesive. And try your best to have your labels not crossing each other, but sometimes it can be unavoidable. So if you must, you can use different colors to differentiate which label is which. All right. So when we're talking about using shapes, illustrations, and images in your illustration or infographic, again, you want to provide the detail that is required in the shape or illustration and nothing more. So you don't want to add unnecessary details. And you also want to avoid abstract images and pictures when you can. And again, this lets the reader focus in on your major messages and doesn't have them waste time on trying to figure out what you mean when you put something really abstract up in, let's say, an infographic. As well, when you're presenting data, whether that be like in a line chart, bar chart, pie chart, etc., keep it simple and don't embellish. I found this really excellent example of a pie chart last night. Apparently this is, but according to the article I was reading, one of the worst pie charts of all time. And pie charts themselves aren't great for visualizing data, but you can see here that whoever designed this tried to be really creative and add like some shading, some 3D effects, and a different color, like different colors throughout the pie chart. But the end effect is like, it's really hard to differentiate the different categories, and the main message is not clear at all. So for data, try and keep it simple. Again, here's some resources that are helpful. So on the left is Smart, a reservoir of cartoon-style medical art that is freely accessible. And on the right is a tool for making scientific images that I imagine many of you are familiar with, called BioRender. So this is kind of a drag and drop platform specifically for scientific illustrations. Something else to highlight here, if you're looking for actual photographs, is the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention. They have a public health image library where, again, you can download pictures to use in your infographics. All right, so now we're actually very close to the end. And one of the last stages when you're making your illustration or infographic is to always try and simplify where you can, to avoid your reader from looking like the person in this image. So this usually involves removing unnecessary words and details in both the text and in the illustration. So something to note for here, there's actually a principle very relevant to this. It's called Mayer's coherence principle. And essentially it states that unnecessary words and details should be eliminated to free up cognitive resources in the reader's memory. So to kind of show this in action, here's an infographic that was curated by our summer intern, Sean, and illustrated by our illustrator, Naomi. And what we're showing here is actually based on a complex theory in the field of addiction medicine called the Morlatz relapse prevention theory. But when we're communicating this with others, especially with lay audiences, that kind of deep theoretical background is not necessary. So we wanted to simplify all the text to just get the key points across. And as well, in the images you can see, or rather the illustrations here, that they're just very simple. There's not too many unnecessary details, but you can still get a sense of what is trying to be communicated. So if you look at, for example, the little kind of emojis, they're very simple, just very clean lines, not very many colors, but you can feel the emotions that they're projecting. Okay, this is the last step. We're finally here, and it's a really important step. And you always want to try and pilot test your illustration if you can. And what this means is, let's say you've gone through all the steps and you have your illustration and you want to work with your intended audience and ask them what they think about your illustration. Ask them if you think it's clear, if they think it's clear, comprehensible, and can understand the major messages. And this can actually elicit really meaningful and purposeful feedback that you yourself or your colleagues would have thought of. So we always recommend pilot testing, particularly key for infographics intended for lay audiences. Something else to note is it can be even better to co-create the illustration or infographic. So working with an intended reader or a few intended readers from the beginning of this process all the way to the end. But unfortunately, sometimes this isn't possible due to time and financial resource constraints. So to give you an example of this, here is an infographic that I worked on alongside our illustrator, Molly. And this is intended for sexual health providers. And it's kind of three steps for them to recognize sexual health anxiety among the clients that they're working with. So the illustration on the left is the one that myself and Molly, that was kind of our final version, but the professor who had requested this wanted to actually ask some healthcare providers about what they thought and if they had any suggestions for improvement. And it turns out that they did. So the healthcare providers highlighted things in the illustration and in the text, and both of these were related to the power differential. So for the illustrations, they said that the healthcare provider shouldn't actually be wearing a white coat, and they should be in more casual clothing. As well, they highlighted that the word client inherently perpetuates a power differential between the healthcare provider and the person accessing services. So for the real final version on the right here, the healthcare provider is in more casual clothing, just with like a name tag and a clipboard to still indicate that they are the healthcare provider. And as well, the word client has been removed and replaced. So again, this was something that myself and Molly and the professor we were working with, we didn't think of this. So that's why getting that key feedback from the intended audience can be really, really helpful. All right, so we've made it till the end of our 8 steps plus additional steps, particularly for infographics. I just want to thank you for listening to the conversation. I'd love to talk with you more. Here's my Twitter and email. As well, on behalf of Sarah and myself, I would like to say a big thank you to the ORT for having us back for a second webinar, particularly Lucy and Dr. Linda Penn. As well, would love to shout out the entire Designs That Sell team for helping us throughout prepare this presentation. And with that, Sarah and I will be around if anyone has any questions. We'd love to answer them.
Thanks for the great talk. Just a question. Have you guys considered helping with content creation for like videos for the lay audience, translating science into videos?
Yeah, that is a great question and something that Design Excel has been interested in for a while. Particularly, like we love those animations that show, like it's really effective to show like cellular processes. Unfortunately, we have not ventured into creating videos at this point, but it's something that, again, like you mentioned, can be really effective and we'd love to get into in the near future.
It's also like a very different type of communication when you talk about video and animation. With a lot of the research that we've done and a lot of the strategies we use, we tend to focus more on the prints or 2D version. However, we do some 3D illustrations and some